It began with a notice, crisp and official, tucked beneath a stone on the grand entrance to what was once a dream. A dream now reduced to splintered wood and scattered memories, all thanks to an HOA that saw a mansion, but not its owner. They saw a debt, but not the deep-rooted power dynamic they were about to disturb. The cold, sterile words declared a demolition, a punitive act for unpaid fees. But how could an association demand payment, much less destroy property, from the very person who held the deeds to their entire dominion? The lakefront estate, a symbol of defiance, crumbled under the weight of an unprecedented act of corporate spite. Yet, the true shock wasn't the dust cloud settling over the ruins, but the chilling realization dawning on every board member: they had just declared war on the individual who, quietly, anonymously, owned the very ground they stood on, the streets they policed, and every single house they governed. They thought they had demolished a home; in reality, they had just activated the sleeping giant who owned their world. What kind of ironclad ownership allowed such a devastating, yet ultimately self-destructive, act of revenge? Before the dust, the demolition crews, and the legal notices that would eventually paper the walls of a forgotten office, there was only the quiet lapping of water against a shoreline. This was Arthur Vance's world. Arthur was a man who had spent 3 decades building a digital empire from a garage, a man whose name was whispered in boardrooms but never seen in headlines. He was a ghost in the machine of modern commerce, and he had designed his life to be exactly that way. After selling his final stake in the company he'd bled for, he sought not another mountain to climb, but a valley to rest in. He found it in a sprawling, undeveloped tract of land surrounding a pristine, spring-fed lake. It was hundreds of acres of untouched pine forest and rocky shores, a place where the loudest sound was the cry of a loon at dusk. This land became his sanctuary. On the most secluded peninsula, accessible only by a long, winding private road, he commissioned a home. It wasn't a mansion in the modern sense of gaudy columns and sprawling marble floors. It was a masterpiece of wood, stone, and glass, designed to blend into the landscape, not dominate it. Its wings followed the curve of the shore, its vast windows framing the shifting seasons of the lake as living art. Here, Arthur spent his days reading, walking the trails he'd carefully carved through the woods, and watching the eagles nest in the old-growth pines. He was a man who had commanded armies of engineers and now found his greatest pleasure in the silent company of trees. He wanted nothing more than to be left alone, to finally enjoy the peace he had so ferociously earned. But such a large piece of land, he knew, would always be a target for developers who would clear-cut the forests and crowd the shoreline with identical, cheaply made houses. To protect his sanctuary, Arthur devised a plan born of quiet genius. He sectioned off the land on the far side of the lake, farthest from his own estate, and developed a small, exclusive community. He named it Serenity Lake Estates. He designed it himself, ensuring large lots, strict environmental protections, and architectural guidelines that favored quality over quantity. He laid the roads, installed the utilities, and then, through a series of trusts and anonymously named LLCs, he sold the lots to families who wanted the same peace he did. He created a homeowners association, seeding it with a charter that prioritized the preservation of the lake's natural beauty. Then, he did the one thing that would ultimately lead to his doorstep: he made himself invisible. He handed control of the HOA over to the residents and retreated back to his peninsula, a phantom landlord who never collected rent, a founding father whose existence was unknown. For years, the arrangement was perfect. The HOA hummed along, a benign entity that organized neighborhood cleanups and sent out pleasant, forgettable newsletters. Arthur paid his own fees, or rather, his financial office did, a quiet, automatic transaction from one of his trusts to the community he had created. He was just another property owner on paper, lot number 1, the largest and most remote parcel in the development. He never attended a meeting. He never voted in an election. He was a name on a spreadsheet, and that was all he ever wanted to be. The shift was subtle at first. A new board president was elected, a woman named Carol who had moved to the community a few years prior. Where the previous board had been relaxed, Carol was militant. She saw the HOA not as a community trust, but as a fiefdom, and she was its queen. The newsletters became less about potlucks and more about infractions. The rules, once gentle guidelines, were now scripture. Carol and her board members became fixtures on the quiet streets, clipboards in hand, measuring the height of lawn grass and the precise shade of beige on mailbox posts. A sense of rigid conformity began to settle over Serenity Lake, a stark contrast to the wild, untamed beauty of the surrounding forest that Arthur had fought to preserve. Arthur, in his splendid isolation, noticed none of this. He skimmed the increasingly aggressive emails and tossed the violation notices, delivered by a courier to his gate, into the recycling bin without a second thought. The first complaints were trivial. A notice about unmanaged native flora on his shoreline, which were the wildflowers he'd allowed to grow wild. Another about the non-standard color of the moss on his stone entryway. To a man who had negotiated billion-dollar mergers, these were gnats buzzing at the window of his fortress. He failed to appreciate the venom of the truly petty, the unyielding drive of someone with a small amount of power and a desperate need to wield it. Carol, on the other hand, became obsessed with the mysterious owner of lot number 1. This absentee landlord, this faceless entity who ignored her official warnings, represented a challenge to her absolute authority. He was the one resident she couldn't intimidate, the one property she couldn't scrutinize by peering over a fence. His silence was not seen as a desire for privacy, but as an act of defiance. The fines began to escalate, from minor infractions to significant penalties, all for violations that were, in essence, Arthur simply letting his part of the forest be a forest. His financial office, following standing orders to handle all routine property matters, continued to pay the standard annual dues. But they had no instructions for these new, arbitrary fines. And so, they went unpaid. In the community forums, whispers began to circulate about the owner of the Grand Lake house. Rumors swirled that he was a reclusive celebrity, perhaps even a criminal in hiding. The unpaid fines, which Carol publicly posted in the monthly financial report, grew into a legend, a mountain of debt attributed to the phantom of the lake. Carol framed it as a story of a wealthy elite who felt he was above the rules that bound everyone else. She painted a target on the back of a man she had never met, whipping the other residents into a quiet frenzy of resentment. They had no idea they were being manipulated into hating the very man who had gifted them their idyllic life, the architect of their serene prison. The trap was being set, not with malice, but with the banal, bureaucratic evil of committees and bylaws. And Arthur, the silent king, never saw it coming, because he simply wasn't looking. The polite, paper-thin veneer of neighborhood decorum was the first thing to tear. The ignored notices about wildflowers and moss-covered stones were replaced by a far more insidious form of harassment. It began with a drone. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Arthur sat in his study overlooking the lake, a high-pitched buzz intruded upon the silence. He glanced up to see the small, quad-bladed machine hovering just beyond his windows, its camera lens a single, unblinking eye. It hovered for a moment, then methodically began to trace the perimeter of his home, documenting every angle, every stone, every pane of glass. It was a flagrant, technologically enabled trespass, a clear violation of his privacy. Arthur, a man who had built his fortune on understanding the architecture of control, knew this was a deliberate provocation. It was a message from Carol and her board: "We are watching you. There is nowhere you can hide." His lawyers, acting on his instructions, sent a sharply worded cease and desist letter citing state laws against surveillance and harassment. The response they received was not an apology, but a copy of an HOA bylaw, buried deep within the charter Arthur himself had long forgotten. It granted the Architectural Review Committee the right to conduct visual inspections of all properties to ensure compliance, using any means necessary. The drone, Carol argued, was merely a modern tool for an old rule. It was a masterful, infuriating piece of legal jujitsu. They were using his own words, twisted and repurposed, as a weapon against him. The drone returned the following week, and the week after that. It became a regular feature of his quiet life, a mechanical mosquito he could not swat. The frustration simmered, a low-grade fever in the back of Arthur's mind. He was being besieged by a committee he had created, a monster of his own making. The sense of peace he had cultivated for years was eroding with each buzz of the rotors. The next escalation was more direct, more primitive. It targeted his isolation. Arthur's long, winding road was his property, but the point where it connected to the main street of Serenity Lake Estates was, technically, adjacent to common ground. One morning, a construction crew arrived without warning. They began excavating the pristine patch of grass at the mouth of his driveway, erecting a monstrous stone and bronze sign declaring, "Welcome to Serenity Lake Estates." It was gaudy, oversized, and positioned in such a way that it made navigating the entrance with any large vehicle, like the delivery trucks that supplied his estate, a painstaking, 10-point turn affair. It was a permanent, physical obstacle, a daily reminder of their power to interfere and annoy. When Arthur's office complained, the HOA cited a community beautification initiative unanimously approved by the board. While these petty wars were being waged on the ground, the financial assault was escalating in the background. The unpaid fines for his violations, the natural shoreline, the unapproved moss, the very existence of his non-conforming paradise, had swelled to a significant sum. To Arthur, the amount was still negligible, less than he might spend on a rare bottle of wine. But to the HOA, it was leverage. The next official document to arrive was not a notice, but a notice of lien. Carroll's board had officially placed a lien on his property. This was the first act that truly pierced Arthur's bubble of detachment. A lien was a legal claim, a cloud on the title of his sanctuary. His chief financial officer, a man accustomed to discussing nine-figure investments, called him with an incredulous tone in his voice. They were discussing a 5-figure lien from a neighborhood committee. For the first time, Arthur felt a flicker of genuine anger. The game had changed. This was no longer about annoying drones or ugly signs. This was a direct challenge to his ownership, a legal stain on his most prized possession. He instructed his legal team to prepare a lawsuit, to crush this ridiculous board with the full weight of his resources. He was ready to end it. But he had forgotten about the most potent weapon he had unwittingly given them. Carol, it turned out, was more than just a power-hungry busybody, she was a diligent student of her own petty tyranny. Late one evening, in the quiet of her beige-walled home office, she was poring over the HOA's founding documents, the dense, legalistic charter Arthur's top-tier corporate lawyers had drafted over a decade ago. And there, in a subclause of a section on financial delinquency, she found it. The clause was standard boilerplate for such documents, a nuclear option rarely used but always present. It stated that in the event of an unpaid lien exceeding a certain amount and a certain time frame, the homeowners association had the right to initiate foreclosure proceedings to recover the debt. A slow, triumphant smile spread across Carol's face. This was it. This was the checkmate she had been searching for. The drone, the sign, the lien, they were just preparatory moves. Foreclosure was the kill shot. The anonymous, arrogant owner of lot number 1 would be forced to bend the knee, or he would lose his precious mansion. The thought was intoxicating. She now possessed the power to evict the phantom from his own paradise. But she couldn't act alone. She needed the support of the community. Carol called an emergency all-hands meeting in the community clubhouse. She stood before the residents, a picture of righteous indignation. She presented a slideshow, detailing the outrageous, unpaid fines of the owner of Lot 1. She framed it as a story of a wealthy outsider who was single-handedly draining the community's resources. This money, she declared, pointing to a chart with a dramatically rising red line, is what stands between us and a new playground for our children. It's what's preventing us from resurfacing the tennis courts and hiring better security. She spun a tale of communal sacrifice and one man's selfish refusal to contribute. She never mentioned that the fines were for things like wildflowers. She simply presented a number and an enemy. The residents, already conditioned by months of her whispers and the resentment she had carefully cultivated, were easily swayed. They saw their own property values, their own amenities, being held hostage. The vote was nearly unanimous. The board was authorized to proceed with whatever legal means were necessary to recover the debt. They were giving Carol a blank check for her vengeance, never suspecting the true identity of the man they had just condemned. Carol, it turned out, was more than just a power-hungry busybody, she was a diligent student of her own petty tyranny. Late one evening, in the quiet of her beige-walled home office, she was poring over the HOA's founding documents, the dense, legalistic charter Arthur's top-tier corporate lawyers had drafted over a decade ago. And there, in a subclause of a section on financial delinquency, she found it. The clause was standard boilerplate for such documents, a nuclear option rarely used but always present. It stated that in the event of an unpaid lien exceeding a certain amount and a certain time frame, the homeowners association had the right to initiate foreclosure proceedings to recover the debt. A slow, triumphant smile spread across Carol's face. This was it. This was the checkmate she had been searching for. The drone, the sign, the lien, they were just preparatory moves. Foreclosure was the kill shot. The anonymous, arrogant owner of lot number 1 would be forced to bend the knee, or he would lose his precious mansion. The thought was intoxicating. She now possessed the power to evict the phantom from his own paradise. But she couldn't act alone. She needed the support of the community. Carol called an emergency all-hands meeting in the community clubhouse. She stood before the residents, a picture of righteous indignation. She presented a slideshow, detailing the outrageous, unpaid fines of the owner of Lot 1. She framed it as a story of a wealthy outsider who was single-handedly draining the community's resources. This money, she declared, pointing to a chart with a dramatically rising red line, is what stands between us and a new playground for our children. It's what's preventing us from resurfacing the tennis courts and hiring better security. She spun a tale of communal sacrifice and one man's selfish refusal to contribute. She never mentioned that the fines were for things like wildflowers. She simply presented a number and an enemy. The residents, already conditioned by months of her whispers and the resentment she had carefully cultivated, were easily swayed. They saw their own property values, their own amenities, being held hostage. The vote was nearly unanimous. The board was authorized to proceed with whatever legal means were necessary to recover the debt. They were giving Carol a blank check for her vengeance, never suspecting the true identity of the man they had just condemned. Then, the machines arrived. Not just one, but a convoy. A massive excavator, its steel arm a predatory claw, led the charge, followed by dump trucks and a smaller bulldozer. They rumbled down Arthur's private drive, their treads tearing at the meticulously maintained gravel, a deliberate act of desecration. A local sheriff's deputy, summoned by Carol to ensure public safety and prevent interference, stood by his patrol car, arms crossed, a silent, imposing figure. The scene was set for the HOA's ultimate victory. The excavator positioned itself before the Grand Lake House, a structure of quiet elegance that now seemed to cower under the shadow of the steel beast. Its vast windows, once reflecting the serene lake, now stared blankly, like eyes awaiting a blow. Carol raised a hand, a theatrical gesture, and the roar of the engine intensified. The massive arm swung, the bucket biting into the cedar siding with a sickening crunch. Wood splintered, glass shattered, and a cloud of dust erupted, momentarily obscuring the scene. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. This was real. This was happening. With each swing, a piece of Arthur's sanctuary was ripped away. The roof groaned, then collapsed inward, sending a cascade of debris tumbling down. The walls buckled, revealing the intricate network of pipes and wires that had once brought life to the home. It was a brutal, methodical dismantling, a physical manifestation of the HOA's petty rage. Carol watched, her smile widening, a glint of vindication in her eyes. The phantom owner had not appeared. He had not sent lawyers to halt the proceedings. He had simply vanished, leaving his monument to be torn down. This, she believed, was the ultimate surrender. As the excavator tore into the final, load-bearing wall, the entire structure groaned one last time, then imploded in a spectacular shower of dust and debris. The lake house, Arthur's quiet haven, was gone. Reduced to a pile of rubble, a scar on the landscape. Carol turned to the board members, her face flushed with triumph. "See," she declared, her voice barely audible over the dying roar of the machinery. "No one is above the rules." It was at that precise moment, as the last echoes of destruction faded and the dust began to settle, that a sleek, black sedan, almost imperceptibly, pulled up to the entrance of Arthur's now demolished private road. It was a vehicle that exuded quiet authority, a stark contrast to the utilitarian trucks of the demolition crew. From it emerged two figures, a man in a perfectly tailored suit, carrying a slim briefcase, and a woman, equally sharp, holding a tablet. They walked with an unhurried, deliberate pace, their eyes fixed not on the rubble, but on Carol. Carol, still basking in her moment of glory, barely registered their arrival until they were standing directly before her, blocking her view of the smoldering ruins. The man extended a hand, not in greeting, but to present a document. His expression was utterly devoid of emotion. "Ms. Vance," he inquired, his voice calm, cutting through the lingering tension. "My name is David Chen. I represent Mr. Arthur Vance." Carol's triumphant smile faltered. "Arthur Vance? Here. Now." She snatched the document, her eyes scanning the official letterhead. It wasn't a cease and desist. It wasn't a new lawsuit. It was something far more chilling. Her gaze dropped to the bolded text, then widened in disbelief. Her breath hitched. The document was a formal declaration. It stated, unequivocally, that as of this very moment, due to the egregious breach of contract and the unlawful destruction of property, all existing agreements between the Serenity Lake Estates Homeowners Association and the various trusts and holding companies owned by Mr. Arthur Vance were hereby terminated. And then, the bombshell. It detailed the true ownership structure. It laid bare the fact that Arthur Vance, through a complex web of shell corporations and trusts, was not merely the owner of Lot Number 1. He was the original developer. He owned the roads. He owned the common areas. He owned the clubhouse. He owned the land under every single house in Serenity Lake Estates. And, most devastatingly, he owned the very entity that held the mortgage on the entire development. Carol's face drained of all color. The blood rushed from her cheeks, leaving her ashen. Her eyes darted from the document to the demolition site, then to the faces of her stunned board members. The triumphant roar of the excavator was replaced by a deafening silence in her mind. She had not just demolished a house, she had demolished the foundation of their entire community. She had foreclosed on Arthur Vance, only to discover that Arthur Vance owned the bank. David Chen, Arthur's representative, continued, his voice a low, steady hum of controlled power. "Effective immediately, all residents of Serenity Lake Estates are hereby notified that their property leases, which are tied to the underlying land owned by Mr. Vance's entities, are under review. Furthermore, the HOA's charter, which grants it authority over these lands, is now null and void, as the primary landowner has withdrawn consent." He paused, allowing the full weight of his words to sink in. "Mr. Vance extends his deepest regrets for the inconvenience, but he can no longer, in good conscience, allow an organization that has so flagrantly abused its power and destroyed his private property to continue operating on land he owns." The sheriff's deputy, who had been listening intently, slowly uncrossed his arms. His eyes, previously fixed on the demolition, now scanned the faces of the HOA board, a new understanding dawning. This wasn't a simple property dispute. This was a corporate earthquake. A collective murmur rose from the residents, no longer whispers of curiosity, but gasps of horror and dawning comprehension. They looked at Carol, their faces contorted with a mixture of fear and betrayal. They had been manipulated, used as pawns in a game they didn't understand, against a man they didn't know, who now held their entire lives in his hands. The new playground, the resurfaced tennis courts, the better security, all of it vanished in the face of this terrifying truth. Their homes, their investments, their very sense of security, were suddenly precarious, built on land owned by a man whose house they had just watched crumble. Carol stumbled backward, clutching the document as if it were a burning ember. Her carefully constructed world, her petty kingdom, had just been vaporized. The power she had so desperately craved, the authority she had wielded with such ruthless abandon, had been an illusion, a temporary loan from the very man she had sought to destroy. The dust from Arthur's demolished mansion settled, not just on the ground, but on the faces of every resident, a grim, gray shroud. They had cheered the destruction, unaware they were cheering the beginning of their own undoing. The silence that followed was not the peace of victory, but the chilling stillness of absolute, irreversible defeat. The dust from Arthur's demolished mansion settled, not just on the ground, but on the faces of every resident, a grim, gray shroud. The silence that followed was not the peace of victory, but the chilling stillness of absolute, irreversible defeat. Carol stood frozen, the legal document clutched in her trembling hand, her mind a maelstrom of disbelief and dawning horror. The world she had so meticulously constructed, the petty kingdom she had ruled with an iron fist, had just been pulverized. Her authority, her carefully cultivated image of righteous leadership, shattered into a million pieces before the very people she had sought to impress. The residents, initially stunned, began to stir. Their murmurs were no longer whispers of curiosity or resentment, but gasps of fear and dawning comprehension. They looked at Carol, their faces contorted with a mixture of betrayal and dawning terror. They had been manipulated, used as pawns in a game they didn't understand, against a man they didn't know, who now held their entire lives in his hands. The new playground, the resurfaced tennis courts, the better security, all of it vanished in the face of this terrifying truth. Their homes, their investments, their very sense of security, were suddenly precarious, built on land owned by a man whose house they had just watched crumble. David Chen, Arthur's representative, allowed the silence to stretch, letting the full weight of his words sink into the stunned crowd. Then, with a calm that was almost surgical, he turned to the sheriff's deputy. "Deputy," he stated, his voice clear and authoritative, "I believe we have witnessed a clear case of unlawful destruction of private property. My client, Mr. Arthur Vance, will be pursuing all available legal avenues to seek restitution for the damages incurred, and to address the egregious breach of contract by the Serenity Lake Estates Homeowners Association." The deputy, a seasoned veteran of small-town disputes, simply nodded, his gaze now fixed on Carol with a look of profound pity and professional obligation. He knew a losing battle when he saw one, and Carol had just lost everything. The demolition crew, sensing the shift in atmosphere, slowly began to power down their machines. The excavator, its work done, sat like a defeated beast amidst the rubble, its claws still stained with the remnants of Arthur's home. The air, once thick with the smell of fresh destruction, now carried the faint scent of fear. Carol, unable to speak, unable to move, felt the collective gaze of the community bore into her. The faces that had once looked to her for leadership now stared with a mixture of accusation and contempt. Her board members, pale and trembling, began to back away, distancing themselves from the epicenter of the disaster. The carefully constructed edifice of her power crumbled, not with a bang, but with the chilling silence of utter repudiation. She was no longer the queen, she was the fool, exposed and humiliated. In the days that followed, the true extent of Arthur Vance's quiet dominion over Serenity Lake Estates became terrifyingly clear. David Chen and his team moved with ruthless efficiency. Formal notices were delivered to every homeowner, not from the HOA, but from Arthur Vance's holding company. These notices informed them that their property deeds, while valid for the structures they owned, were essentially long-term leases for the underlying land, leases that were now subject to review and potential renegotiation. The HOA, stripped of its authority, its charter nullified, ceased to exist as a governing body. Its bank accounts were frozen, its assets seized to begin the process of compensating Arthur for the demolition. Carol and the remaining board members found themselves facing not only the wrath of their former neighbors but also the very real threat of personal liability for the millions of dollars in damages. Carol's life, once defined by her petty power, imploded. The community, once her loyal subjects, now shunned her. Her carefully manicured lawn became overgrown, her mailbox overflowing with angry letters and legal threats. The very people she had rallied against Arthur now turned on her, their fear morphing into bitter resentment. She was forced to sell her home, not for profit, but to cover the initial legal costs and the mounting demands for restitution. She left Serenity Lake Estates a pariah, her name synonymous with ruin, her ambition having devoured her entirely. The irony was a bitter pill. She had sought to control a community, only to be utterly consumed by it. For the residents, the initial panic was profound. Their homes, their investments, their futures, all seemed to hang by a thread. Whispers of mass evictions, of forced sales, swept through the community like wildfire. Families who had poured their life savings into their Serenity Lake dream faced the terrifying prospect of losing everything. The fear was palpable, a constant hum beneath the surface of every conversation. They had blindly followed Carol, believing her narrative of the arrogant outsider, and now they were paying the price. But Arthur Vance was not a man driven by petty revenge. He was a man who sought peace, and who, when provoked, would dismantle the source of the disturbance with surgical precision. His actions were not about inflicting suffering, but about re-establishing control and ensuring his sanctuary remained inviolable. He had taught them a brutal lesson, but he was not a cruel master. After weeks of agonizing uncertainty, David Chen called a final, mandatory meeting for all residents. The clubhouse, once the scene of Carol's triumphant pronouncements, was now filled with anxious, subdued faces. Chen stood before them, a single document in his hand. He explained Arthur's position. The HOA had been dissolved, its actions deemed unlawful. The demolition of his home was a profound violation. However, Mr. Vance recognized that many residents had been misled and were innocent parties in Carol's machinations. He then laid out Arthur's resolution. All existing land leases would be honored, with new, simplified terms that removed the onerous, petty restrictions that had plagued the community. The underlying land would remain under Arthur's ownership, but the residents would retain full, unencumbered ownership of their homes. The new terms included a significantly reduced annual land fee, a fraction of what the HOA had once demanded in dues and fines. Most importantly, the new charter, drafted by Arthur's team, was designed to be minimal, focusing solely on environmental preservation and the maintenance of common infrastructure, with no room for arbitrary rules or petty enforcement. There would be no more architectural review committees, no more drone surveillance, no more fines for wildflowers. The community would be self-governed by a simple, transparent council focused on practical needs, not power. There was a collective sigh of relief, a wave of emotion that swept through the room. They had been spared. Their homes were safe. Their investments secure. But the lesson had been learned. They had seen the consequences of unchecked power, of blind trust, and of allowing resentment to fester. The community of Serenity Lake Estates was forever changed. The residents, once quick to judge and eager to conform, now approached community matters with a newfound caution, a deep understanding of the fragility of peace and the insidious nature of petty tyranny. As for Arthur, the site of his demolished mansion remained untouched for a time, a stark, silent monument to the conflict. He spent months walking the perimeter, contemplating the empty space where his sanctuary had stood. Eventually, he commissioned a new structure, not a replica, but a smaller, even more secluded retreat, built deeper into the woods, almost invisible from the lake. He wanted no grand statements, no visible reminders of the battle. He simply wanted his peace back. The long-term impact on Serenity Lake Estates was profound. The community became quieter, more introspective. The residents, humbled by their near loss, fostered a genuine sense of mutual respect, born from shared adversity. They understood that true community was built on trust and empathy, not on rigid rules and the abuse of power. The memory of Carol and the demolished mansion served as a constant, unspoken reminder of the dangers of allowing petty politics to fester, of letting small grievances escalate into catastrophic conflicts. Arthur Vance, the silent king, retreated once more into his solitude. He had dismantled the machine he had created, not out of malice, but out of a profound need to protect his peace. He had reminded an entire community that true power often lies not in the loudest voice or the most aggressive action, but in the quiet, undeniable truth of ownership. He had taught them that sometimes, the most dangerous opponent is the one you never see coming, the one who holds all the cards, and who, when pushed too far, will simply reclaim the entire table. The story of Serenity Lake Estates became a cautionary tale, whispered among real estate agents and HOA boards across the region. It was a stark reminder that in the intricate dance of property and power, one must always know who truly owns the ground beneath their feet. For sometimes, the person you seek to control is the very architect of your world, and their quiet patience is merely the prelude to an overwhelming, undeniable truth. What happens when the rules you enforce are built on land owned by the very person you're trying to punish? The answer, as Serenity Lake Estates learned, can be the demolition of everything you thought you controlled.